All right, let me go ahead and make sure everyone can see this okay. Can everyone see this all right?
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, well, Sheridan gave us a great introduction, so we will go ahead and dive in. So as she said, my name's Elena Setterlin. I know a lot of you, but I'm on the web division and I'm the director of web design and UX. I live up in beautiful Negaunee, Michigan, up in the upper peninsula of Michigan. And I'm the inquisitive and creative storyteller. And I want to note today that we have taken special care to actually showcase our colors as well as what they mean, and giving a little bit more context. And you'll see why we've done that a little bit later on. But from there, I'm going to pass it over to Bomi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bomi. I'm a UX designer on the team, and I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I am a resilient and inquisitive researcher, and my colors are yellow, green, and maroon. So I'm going to actually try to share a little bit about my background to accessibility, which started while I was a student at Northeastern. However, like many UX students, like it was not a part of curriculum or anything that we were taught in school. So I just got lucky to work with the Northeastern ITS department, where I had a mentor who taught me a lot about accessibility that I'm excited to share with you guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Bomi. All right, so let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So here's a summary of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to do an introduction to designing for accessibility and give a little bit of background information about web accessibility, just because I know there are some folks that might not be super familiar with accessibility. And then we're going to go over these areas of design, typography, color, layout, and spacing, user interface elements. And then at the end of our presentation, we're going to have a few slides that will have tools and recommended courses and resources. We probably won't get to showing all those, but they will be out there for you to take a look at after the presentation. And then in between, we're also going to be doing some demos of tools that we use and some client examples. All right, so let's get into what web accessibility is. So what is web accessibility and why is it important? So that means that websites and tools and technologies are designed and developed to work with people that have disabilities, as well as people who don't have disabilities. So we really think about web accessibility as something that can benefit all users. And particularly, these are some of the disabilities that affect what people do to access the web. So we have auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual. And I do want to say that we're using disability as like a broad term today. We know that there's many folks that have disabilities that don't really consider them a disability. They embrace them, but we are using that as a broad term today. So I just wanted to preface that. And then it's really interesting to know that 20% of users have a disability. So that's a huge portion of the population that we need to make sure we're creating digital experiences that accommodate their various needs. And then over here on the right-hand side too, I wanted to notate that we have an image of a user actually using a Braille display. So if they're blind and also know Braille, this is an assistive technology that they can use. So they're using this with a regular keyboard. This is just one example, but we're going to be touching on some assistive technologies today as well as we kind of go through the different design aspects. And so we want to talk a little bit about the core principles and compliance levels. So these are some core fundamentals when it comes to web accessibility. Obviously, this is just kind of touching the surface of accessibility. There's a lot more to learn. And we have a link out to the WCAG link, and you can take a look at all the different resources out there. But these are some pieces that we definitely consider when we're designing. So the core principles are making sure that things are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And so perceivable means that information can be presented in a variety of different ways. So we need to make sure that we can accommodate how users are perceiving information, no matter what their abilities are. And then operable means like functionality. So this can be different modalities of how somebody can actually operate a website. So for example, like the Braille display. And then understandable, this really goes back to the type of content and how content is created on a website. So a good example of this is thinking about somebody who is blind, who's using a screen reader, which is another assistive technology. If they can't see images, we have to make sure that there is alternative text added to those images. So when they're using a screen reader, they can understand what they're looking at or what they're accessing. And then robust is the last one of the core principles. And this is really something that kind of goes back to the technology that we all use. So making sure that users can access websites on a variety of different devices and browsers, and also making sure that they can access it on their choice of assistive technology. And then over to the right-hand side of the slide, we are going to be using these terms as well, talking about levels of compliance. So we have A, AA, and AAA. And A is kind of like the baseline of meeting legal requirements. And then AA is the should have, and AAA is the good to have. So we always want to make sure we're at least meeting the AA, and AAA is what we strive for. But that's really where we kind of fall within our compliance. And so the next thing we want to talk about today, and I think this is a really good thing for us to touch on, as we have this internal conference, and is talking about how accessibility is everyone's responsibility. So we want to ensure that our digital products, and not just our digital products, but all the products that we're creating at Carnegie are accessible, and that this is a team effort. So we all have a really unique role to play in ensuring that our products are accessible. And we don't want it to be, accountability falling on maybe a designer or just a developer. It's a group effort. And we have linked out this really helpful PDF that you can take a look at after the presentation. And this goes into, what is the team responsible for as a whole, and what are each of the roles responsible if you're a product owner or a designer. So definitely take a look at that. And yeah. So next we're going to talk about typography, and I will pass it over to Bomi.
Thanks, Elena. So this is where we talk about, like, as a designer, what are the things that you need to consider? What are your responsibilities when you are designing a website? And one of those things is typography. We need to consider we need to make sure that the text within your website is optimized for diverse audience, like it's readable for readers of different audience. And so this is where you consider things like font selections, the sizes and weights, the hierarchy, which is very important. And this is also where you have to think about things like, oh, my text have to remain within the viewport sizes for when I'm for viewers. This is where you consider the several functionalities of it. So talking about the hierarchy specifically, this is where you have to think about people who are blind and people who are going to be using screen readers, which is one of the two. This is where you think about how optimizing the hierarchy. This is where you think about how, okay, you need to make sure that your headings, you have properly indicated your headings in each section, instead of you just using like bold text or like, bold typefaces. You have to think about how this hierarchy would help communicate different subheadings to your readers. And this is how you think about avoiding things like spellings, abbreviation mistakes, because they are going to be using screen reader to listen to these things. You need to think about having properly have H2 and H3 highlighted. You also have to think about how your margins and certain things like that should not affect your text sizes across.
Awesome. Thanks, Bomi. Yeah, so another thing we want to talk about too today is color. And this is where we'll probably spend a little bit more time diving into the tools we use and a couple client examples. So how do users perceive color? So it's really different from user to user. And I think this is something that a lot of us who don't have maybe color vision deficiencies don't think about on like a regular basis. But 1 in 12 men are colorblind, while only 1 in 200 women have some type of color vision deficiency, but that's still a really large portion of the population. And one of the most common ones is deuteranomaly, which is a red-green colorblind. And you can see over to the right of the slide, we have kind of the compare and contrast of these different types of color vision deficiencies. So if you're normally looking at a bag of Skittles, this is what it would look like. If you have that red-green colorblind, or if you have these other types of deficiencies, those are what you'd be looking at. And so to accommodate these various ways that users perceive color, we as designers need to be mindful of these 4 factors. So that's color contrast, color vision deficiencies like we're talking about, color luminance, and then also color dependence versus independence. And I'll show an example of what that means. So next I want to talk about color contrast. And so color contrast is a really critical element that we feel like often gets overlooked, especially on websites. We look at tons of websites and do these audits, and we realize lots of people are using yellow text on a white background or whatever the case is. And this isn't always something that you might learn, in design school. It's something that Bomi and I have learned as we've, worked on websites together. And not only does color contrast affect web design, but it also has a major impact on digital ads, landing pages, and the print design that we're doing as well. So I think kind of our goal is to see, these color contrast, elements be incorporated more across Carnegie. And so we have a few go-to tools that we use every day when we're designing. And the number that we always have to think about when it comes to that contrast ratio is 4.5 to 1. And so over here on the right-hand side, you can see this is one of my favorite color contrast checker tools. It's actually an extension, and there's a web app, and we'll have those linked out after this as well. And so you can see we have one that is scoring really well and one that is not meeting contrast at all. So this is just an example of what we see. And from here, I want to dive into actually looking at an example, which we all have some familiarity with, which is the Carnegie Chem dashboard. And so I'm logged in right now into my own profile, and I felt like this was a perfect example to showcase this. And so up here, this is that extension that I was just talking about. So let's take a look at that real quick. And we can see, I had one loaded in here already, but let's just try out this orange one, for example. So if we use the foreground color, do the color picker, and then use the white, we can see technically this text is not meeting compliance. So we're only at a 2.22, which we need to be at a 4.5 to 1. So this is a good example of not having good contrast, but we do have some connotation as far as what does this orange color mean? It means creative and imaginative. And so let's take a look at maybe one that does pass. So this red color for cheerful and enthusiastic, let's try it out. Okay, so perfect. This is meeting the 4.5 to 1. And so we would consider, okay, this is actually something that we can use. So this is just a great tool to use across the board, and we use it every day. It's really handy. I like how visual it is as well. And you can actually even like adjust the colors too. If you're like trying to tweak a color and be like, ooh, I want it to be a little bit darker to meet that threshold. And then as we scroll down, I wanted to also make a note about color independence versus color dependence. So we want to create designs that are color independent. And that means that somebody who doesn't see color, for example, a colorblind user, they are not going to have to just rely on color alone to access information. But they'll have some type of other context to know, okay, this is a color with a little bit of text. I know what this means. But on the Carnegie Chem example, at first glance, unless you hover over each of these, you actually don't know what the colors mean. And so let's actually take a look now at the color blindness simulator. This is another tool that we really like to use, and we'll be linking this out as well. So if you click on here, we can try out one of the most common ones, which is that Deuter anomaly, the red-green colorblind. And if we click, all of a sudden you can see how things are really starting to shift. Maybe they're still kind of in that same spectrum of the shades or the hues of color, but they're definitely a lot different than what they were intended to be. And then let's try another one. This one, the tritanopia, all of a sudden things are really skewed. So we're seeing very different colors that are supposed to be intended, or that are intended to be completely different colors. So for example, down here, the orange all of a sudden kind of becomes, to my eye, more of like a dark coral color. And then the red is a little bit of like a darker red. And the green, that bright green, becomes kind of like this tealish color. So this is a good example just to show that the way that you look at color on here using this color blindness tester really skews what these colors are supposed to be. So let's see what happens if this isn't as common, but some people do have full color blindness. So if you all of a sudden go grayscale, all these colors become, there's no context, right? So they are color dependent because you only have the numbers and you might not always understand what those mean. So this is a good example of, maybe adding a little bit more context for folks. And then one other thing I wanted to mention is color luminance. And that is kind of like how light or how dark a color is. And that's another thing that Bomi and I use to pick out colors that are accessible. So you can see like this is showing very lightly and this is showing a very dark value. So we can use this tool to test that as well. So going from here, we wanted to talk about a couple client examples that we have recently encountered on Curry College as well as University of Mount Union. So we're going to jump over to the Curry College current homepage. And so when we recently redid, so the creative team redid a creative concept for Curry College, and we also found, we need to make some changes to their current site and also incorporate those new designs. So we were taking a look at like their menu, for example, and we're seeing there is this gold color on white. And so, we tested it out like we did before and tested the yellow, which is right here. And we can see, okay, that's not meeting contrast. So in this case, what Bomi and I did is for the new build, we were like, okay, let's ditch the yellow. It's not really working in a lot of places. And we use just this purple with kind of a purple indicator, as well as making sure like these links are a lot more obvious. On the current menu on Curry, it's actually like yellow on this light gray, which is very difficult to read, even for me as somebody that has good vision. So another example of this is actually the University of Mount Union. Again, kind of same thing where it was an integrated client and we had a campaign concept that we needed to work from. So I'll show this really quickly and then we will keep moving. So for example, there was this red color, here we go, in the stats panel. And we were like, ooh, we really like the way this looks, but is it accessible? So we found that it was not, and we had to make some quick changes on the actual site. So this is the homepage redesign. And we use the red as kind of like a decorative thing, and then use the purple and black on white, which was accessible. So these are just a couple examples, but we come across these a lot. And it's just important to be mindful of these pieces. All right, so I'm going to keep moving through. So let's talk a little bit about layout and spacing. So we really have to be mindful about a clear layout and design when it comes to accessibility. So for example, we need to make sure we're designing for different viewport sizes and ensuring that, users that have low vision can magnify on a website and, not lose content. So we have a good example of that over here from the Reed College website. So this is a desktop view of student testimonials. that we have up in like a 3-up row. But then if you were to zoom in 200%, you would just basically kind of get something that is going to ebb and flow depending on the device you're on. And it will stack down and you'll be able to scroll through it like normal. And so that's really important because we don't want to have users have to zoom in and like do a multi-directional scroll and maybe like get confused or like they're losing content, they can't read everything at once. So this is something we think about a lot, and making sure our sites are responsive and the layouts are very clear for people who have disabilities. Another thing is spacing. So this is just a couple examples of accessibility or accessible spacing that we have to consider. So the first one is proximity. So we always have to think about, you know, how far apart is an icon? Are people that have maybe dexterity limitations, are they going to be able to tap on an icon and accurately like get to, you know, the page they're looking for example? And this also goes hand in hand with target size minimum. So we have to have enough space, like enough surface area for somebody to actually be able to like tap a button or click a button and have the accuracy to do that. So a good example of this is, have you ever been like on an e-commerce website and you're like trying to get to your cart, for example, but the icons are way too close to each other. So you end up hitting another button and you're going into like the search or the menu. Like, think about how frustrating that is. It's 10 times worse for somebody that has dexterity problems. So we have to be really mindful of spacing in this context. All right, and I'm going to pass it over to Bomi to talk about a few more user interface elements.
Okay, so before I talk about like some of those interface elements that we use across the websites, I want to talk about how important like these little interface elements are to accessibility. And I'm going to use like links and buttons as examples of that. So links are like action. They're like when the situation where the actions are navigational, where the buttons, the actions are actionable. So meaning like for buttons, either you have to do like upload this document, you click on the button to upload, either you click to create or submit, but link, and it happens on the same page, but links like takes you, you click on the links, either takes you to another page or it navigates you down to the bottom of the page. So in this case, for people who are using keyboard, that have to, for keyboard users, what they do is for you to select a link, you have to use spacebar, or sorry, to select buttons, you can use spacebar or enter button. But if you're using links, you can only use spacebar for it. So in a case where a button is programmed as a link and they click on the enter spacebar for it, it's not going to work. But when the button is programmed as a button and they use spacebar, in that case, it's going to work. So this is just the little ways in which, like, if those user interface predicaments are not properly styled and thought through, they can affect, and they would not meet up to accessibility compliance. But thinking about link styling itself, like you have to make sure, one of the major things is to make sure that it looks like a link, like whoever is seeing it for the first time can understand that immediately this is a link. And an example of this is like the screenshot we have here from Belmont and St. Thomas universities that we worked on. Like looking at the screenshot, just from like one of the things that you have to consider is like, make sure it's bold, think about the colors, and think about like how it's going to stand out. So if you look at this link from Belmont and you look at it, it's red, it's underlined, immediately oh, this is a link. It's actionable. And if you look at the other types too, where you look at the request info, you look at the visit campus and the apply now, there's also something where you have to consider similarity. So if like you have a button styling, it has to remain the same across the site so it doesn't confuse the users. And so the same way for people who are going to be using the screen reader for it, one button styling is not going to be announced different from the other button styling. One link styling. So, and to talk about the button, and sorry, another example that we have for the links is, so we've attached some screenshots here for like St. Thomas and University of Dallas of different ways that, we can style links. For instance, in this event panel case, we have the heading itself styled as the link. Sometimes if you look across some certain sites and you see that you look at the links, or like event panels like this. They will have the heading separate and they will have like a link that says read more. And in this case, we eliminate that part and then have the heading itself as the link. And the other example, which is the one for U Dallas, is in this case, we made the cards the link. And we think about, you know, and then we have these cards in like different colors in which we've tested out the hues and then like the accessibility of it. And so this about like other examples that we've done. Now to talk about the buttons. Kind of like I've mentioned earlier, it's like you have to think about similarity, you have to think about consistency, and you have to think about distinctiveness. Like if you have like, you know, one color for a link, apply the same color across the side, you know, just to keep up the consistency. And you have to think about how people can look at the button and just simply know this is a button. You know, they know this is an actionable, you know, item for me once they see it. And one of the tools that we use, we're not going to test this one out, is Button Buddy, but we have attached the link below for anybody who wants to, you know, take a look at it and test it out. But I also added screenshots of what it looks like when we're testing these buttons. So for instance, if you look at the first one, the button color is blue and the text color is white, and then the background is dark. So if you look on the side, it has like, you know, the color code for each of it. And on the sides is telling you the surface and the background color, which is for the button, they are accessible. But the background and the text color, they're not accessible. It's not even meeting up to the 4.5 contrast standard that is usually used. And if you look at the other button, the background is white, the button color is blue, and the text color, is yellow, and the text color is blue. So in this case, the text and the button color, they are accessible. So you could easily say, oh, that works fine, but the surface color is different. So in this case, it's showing on the side. You can see surface and background is 1 point something. So it's not even meeting up to the standard. So, and this is where I now talk about information bearing element and maybe a little bit more about the contrast ratio that I've been mentioning before. So it's like, if you think about, you know, information bearing elements, these are like things that are important to be seen. And we have like two different ways that we can split those. So if you think about things like text, buttons with text, or like icons, this is the part where the 4.5 contrast ratio or even higher than that works. So for instance, so like the contrast ratio, the reason why it's 4.5 to begin with is because it compensates like for the contrast sensitivity of people who are experiencing like 20 to 40 vision loss, people who have that, it works well. That's why the 4.5 ratio. But if you think about the elements that get the exception for the 4.5, this is like the UI controls, like the example we're looking at in the screenshots. If you have like large text with like 14-point bold or like 8 points regular, that's where you see, you know, these things are applicable. So we also have forms. This way I'll hand over to Alina.
Sorry, Bomi. Thanks. Awesome. Thanks, Bomi. And then this is the last thing we want to talk about for user interface elements is forms. And this is something we wanted to bring up because we feel like it really applies to everyone on the Carnegie team. A lot of us use these for landing pages and websites. Couple things to note. This is an example from Luther College. And so the first thing is that we always keep the input field label on the outside. And then we never have placeholder text because this can actually trigger screen readers to think that a form might already be completed in some way. So we want to make sure that we are setting these forms up in a way that really helps sighted users as well as people using screen readers to be able to go through and complete these requests for information forms. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the error messages that we use on these forms. So we make sure that they're not color dependent and that there's enough context for a user to understand what they need to do to complete a form. Awesome. So that is all we have for today. We do have a lot more resources. I'll just kind of click through and just show. We're going to be linking these out and you can take a look at all the different tools we use today, but we're just really excited that we were able to introduce some of this information and looking forward to, you know, sharing out more things and maybe having another workshop one of these days for it. So thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Elena. Thanks, Bomi. Hope you all gathered a lot of information and learned a lot today, and we'll see you at the rest of the sessions.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, y'all.